So what I'm doing today is I have some watercolor paper. I love this Canson cold press. What I do is I take sheets of it, and they also, I should mention, they sell these ready-made with the actual fold for cards. So I thought instead of actually doing full sheets, I actually went ahead and folded it with what I use just a bone folder and create nice little cards. And my goal today is try to get to maybe work on one as the other one dries, if that's a possibility, but also maybe for the first one, just a simple approach. You can actually use pencil if you want. And I have an image on screen. So I did send two images. One where there's a main, just one flower in the middle, and one with several that may be a second option for composition, the one you see on screen now. So I'm going to go with this one. And what I wanted to point out is we can actually have pencil lines to draw. And I wanted to show you that just in case you wanted to go with what are we doing for our poinsettia. So if you count the leaves here, there's tons. But you don't actually have to draw every single one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to consider the framing, the composition. Do I want to go portrait, landscape? I think landscape will work a little bit better for this one. If I want to create a frame around the edge with a little masking tape, I could also do that. I think I'm actually going to go this way. And I'm going to start with the center. So very light pencil lines, creating the nice little golden yellowish shapes in the middle. How much detail am I going to add to that? It's up to you. And what I want to go from here is I'm going to go with the biggest vein of the first petal that I see here. And I'm going to try to shape it and create that nice curve to match that same vein. Now remember, I'm working with very light pencil lines. I may be working a little darker so you can see them. I'm going to go with the second in the opposite direction and just a little bit smaller leaf, a little petal. And when I have these set up as I like to think of it a north, south, east, west kind of directional. That way I can see my edges a little bit better. One great way is to draw that vein down the middle and then just use that as your guide to create the edge. Okay, to use a little bit of eraser if you need to work that nice. There's a nice accent in the points here to actually get the good look. And this one I'm going to, not exactly at 9 o'clock, I'm going to push it just up a little bit in this direction, like you see here. And the idea is going to be, once I have a drawing, and you see it coming together now, where I have petals that are becoming just a little bit bigger. Maybe they overlap. In this case, it does so on one side and it doesn't on the other. So I want to keep that overlap just underneath and begin to see the patterns of how these are arranged. So you see how they get a little bit bigger. And I get to work just under a little bit of space needed here if you want that nice look. So it doesn't go all the way to the middle. There's a little bit of just the handle of the petal here where we see it just hide underneath. And just exploring and discovering the actual shapes and the patterns will give you tons of creative freedom to begin to take the shapes in the direction you want. So I'm pretty happy with this already. Do I need to saturate a little more? I'm going to add one more right here. So as you can see, they begin to kind of star shape and work themselves in the middle. So I would expect to see another one here and another one here. But I think I could do away with just these for now. And if I wanted to, I could add just a little bit of what will be the green. If you wanted to do that, just a little bit of green in the background. Maybe here, and just one over here to the edge. So notice here I'm shifting the composition to add a little bit of green in the background. And I'll go with that. So there's a nice simple drawing. Do you have to be so precise with the drawing? No, I'll show you a second option where we're going to play with the shaping of those petals. Now, technique. I'm going to use this bigger brush. This is one of those Japanese brushes where I can play with wet on wet, wet on dry. Wet on dry is going to be a little bit easier. What I want to do is choose my color. So cadmium red, a little bit watered down cadmium red is going to be a great option. And you'll see why. It's a little more opaque. Just a little more opacity, so it stains faster. So I want to make sure I have more water than pigment for these first strokes. And I want to start, usually we go from the biggest to the simplest. I want to start from the smallest in this case, which is right here at the top in our front. Ooh, that's loaded. Very, very loaded here. And work my way opposite. So this is wet on dry, just really watered down. But it is, as you see, it's very opaque pigment. So this is kind of a cadmium red, pyrrole red, any warm red. But also alizarin crimson will work. And I want these to just start taking shape where I could also do the same with the brush. Now the overlap, shouldn't I be working backwards towards the front? Yes, absolutely. What I want to do here is I'm going to play with the technique a little bit. And I'm going to create these. And as they begin to dry just a touch, I'm going to use that edge to then play with the background, creating sort of a little edge that kind of hints at a little bit of a shadow. Now, do I want to get into these bigger areas here and let that flow? I could. So, continuing with the wet on wet. And I will let this dry. So I'm going to come around here very carefully and try to stay just a touch on the edge, the one area where I want to be just a little bit careful. And I want to let these colors not fully dry, but begin to dry. So there's infinite ways to work this in terms of technique, wet on dry, wet on wet, and which pattern you want to apply the colors. You want to go background towards the foreground, foreground towards the background. As you combine those two, just those two, between technique and strategy, you'll end up with your own recipe, your own way of coming up with these. And already I could see I'm enjoying this. Very easy for this to move and kind of push it in a different direction. So this is not as loose. This would not be the loose painting. This is more of a illustration approach, where we're considering I don't want to say a more generic look. It's not a realistic. Some may say, well, that looks realistic to me. Well, I'm not looking for that veiny. A little bit for the velvety, yes, the reason I chose that color. Definitely like that look. Adding just a touch more water and a little bit of pigment. And coming over here. Just with a few lines, staying away from the edge. This brush gives me such a fine point and also great coverage, especially for shaping petals. It comes in very, very handy. So as you can see, I got nice even coverage. Wet on dry does start becoming a little bit velvety. I like that look. The paper is also responding well. And I'll go ahead and finish this last one here and set it aside to dry while I work on the second. So if you wanted to work on sketches, several ideas on just one watercolor sheet, that would be ideal for today's exercise. If you had time and you want to set up the card idea where you can measure it. Well, the measurement here is 5 by 7. Did I measure it 5 by? Maybe it's, yeah, I believe it's 5 by 7. So you just double that and you end up with 5 by 14. So what I did is I cut up a sheet of 11 by 14 into 2 and then folded it. So here we are. Now, while this is wet on dry, I could always bring carefully a touch of wet on wet and drop a little bit of pigment just in the middle of these veins. Now remember, it's at the point. What matters here is the level of moisture. So this is still very wet. There's areas where it's becoming a little drier, and that'll give me a little bit of granulation, a little bit of flow. And I think I could absolutely use that. Okay, so here's version 1. And I'm thinking I could do maybe 2 or possibly 3 today. So I'm just going to move this aside. So version 2, I am going to use the same subject, the same reference. But this time, I'm not going to use pencil line. I am going to try. I'm going to use just a variation of my cadmium red. This is called Pyrrole Scarlet. It's a warm red, but you may see the difference. And what I want to do is maybe a combination of, I'm thinking pretty much the same way I did earlier with my drawing. What I want to do is apply and draw directly with the brush. So here's what I'm talking about. Shaping the brush, having a brush that gives you just a little bit of automatic shape. Maybe needs to be wider, so we give it a second pass at the edge here. And notice how it's very wet on dry. I could also, and I'm going to do this carefully here, I'm trying to get a little bit of water off the brush. There may be a little bit of pigment. I'm considering the middle, leaving that center, and I'm just adding water here. So you may not be able to see it. It was actually a little cleaner than I was hoping for. I'm adding a little bit of, tiny bit of pigment so you could see. And I'm going to hope for a nice wet on wet variation to the technique. So there's a little bit of water and I'm just going to drop in the pigment. And I'll do it on both ends. Run the line. And so here's where you get to play with handling of technique. How much pigment, how much water. And I think this, as it settles, I want to give it a little bit of movement. So I'm using a little bit of gravity all the way to the edge. And that's already looking very, very nice. So there we are. So using wet on wet, wet on dry techniques directly with the brush. And you can actually go outside of it now. So if you have that image in your mind where you see the edges, and as long as you have that nice negative space playing here in the middle, seeing the overlap, it could get tricky. So pencil lines, great ally, great friend. There's going to be shapes on top of these when I create a new layer. But not every poinsettia is full of leaves. We could do one where we only do a minimal amount of petals. And I could do that here. I could see this one. Again, working with wet on dry. Seeing the edges. And it will take just a little bit of time to let these layers dry. If you need to work a little faster, then the hair dryer becomes your best friend. I'm not a big fan. I love watercolor when it naturally dries. There's something about the look of it. And I've had debates where you can't even tell if it was naturally dried or hair dried. I think I pick up something in the movement of the pigments. Just personally, it's one of those things. But this allows you to really explore possibilities with drawing with watercolor directly, and also for playing with technique. So as you can see, the brush directly, and it is going to look much, much nicer. There's going to be a really nice look happening when we, let's see, let me take this one a little bit to the edge. This was my wet on wet. So I'm extending the edge. I'm just taking it to the side. And now we have one beautiful first layer. Great, beautiful shape with a little bit of variety here in this petal we did here with the wet on wet. And that's just another variation of it. Let me get just a little bit of excess water and add one more. Just one tiny little. Bit of color in this space. Now I mentioned lifting. As I use a paper towel, for example, to dry, fully dry and squeeze out the water of this brush, completely off of it, shape it. I could actually use my brush to lift and create. This is just, again, expanding the use of your techniques. Notice how it picks up a little bit of pigment and it shows you just a little bit of light. I like to bring in a little water again to the edge. And this has to be done timely. It cannot, once it's settled, and it's stained the paper, you're doing a different type of lifting. There we are. So I'll use this as a layer, and I'll come back and draw some of the edges and a couple of, just 3 or 4 more petals on top of this, where we'll create that kind of three-dimensionality with watercolor using the glaze as well. Let's go back and revisit this one. Now this one's really wet still. So I'm going to go ahead and lift just a little bit, especially from this one. Now for those greens, I'm actually going to go ahead and bring this in now as I work in and around these edges with a little more a cool green. This is Perylene green. So you want to have a green that it may contrast. It gives you a little bit of that in terms of temperature. Cooler, meaning bluer, not yellower. And you know the green sits in the middle of blue and yellow. The more it leans towards the blue, the better. You'll have just a bit mintier is the word that I want to think of here. And just to compensate the warm color that I have with the red, make sure your pigment is dry. If they start bleeding into each other, you'll have a little bit of a mess. But the opportunity to play here with brushes, watercolor techniques, drawing, mixed media, which is the next one I want to show you. So I'm doing these in stages. Remember, this was, let's call it card number 1, where we had pencil lines, and you can still see a few of those pencil lines. I'm going to get some of this watercolor a little bit looser, and you can still see some of those edges, but most of it has been wet on dry. No second layer applied yet, but I will come over and rework some of that in there. And what I want to do, again, letting it sit dry just a little bit, but without too much risk, I'm going to shift to a little bit of alizarin crimson here. And I want to touch it over the edges. Now, one thing I don't want is that blend of color along the side of the greens here. And what I want to do is create that soft edge, not just in the white spaces, but kind of creating a bit of a shadow underneath the leaves, or the petals, I'm sorry, where you would see, oh, I see it. It's which one is juxtaposed, which one's on top, and which one is a little bit darker underneath. And also you get to play a little bit with the technique, adding a little water to the edge, glazing the color, allowing the two reds to kind of mix. And you do pick up a little bit of that edge. Did have a little bit of that green come in. And sometimes it's fine. Now you don't want it to go all the way to the middle. You want to preserve a little bit of that space, and you'll see why. Because there we're going to go a little bit darker. And you can do this in stages. Lifting again, a few lines, a little bit of that dry brush. One thing I always like to bring up, only you get to give yourself the permission to explore, expand as far as you want. So it's up to you to take this to a place where it's even more abstract in a way. So this one, I could come back and touch, and we will when this dries just a little bit more. And maybe add a few layers, one more layer of color. Clean up just a little bit here. But in terms of drawing and technique, I want you to see how far are you willing to go with experimenting. And I mean experimenting with drawing, experimenting with shapes, even experimenting with color. This lends itself perfectly. Now the one thing is just maybe having a little bit of patience or strategy to allow things to dry and be able to come back to it. So this is moist, not fully dry, but it will work for this second layer. It's damp. So what I do here is I'm grabbing more pigment, meaning it's a little more saturated this time than the previous. And most of it, again, we did wet on dry. Here you could go back and do a little bit of wet on wet. For time purposes, it would take a little longer, just so you know. But you can actually come back and revisit some of these leaves. So I have these in the back, and I want to go ahead and create some of these edges. So this first one here, for example, smaller little leaf. Oop, it is still very wet. Let's go ahead and lift that. But you can see how immediately you have this sense of volume. Now it did still have a lot of moisture. I was able to pick up a little bit of the edge, but it's going to bleed out a little bit. But there was a little bit of a valley there that was holding water. Do I need to add a little more value, meaning a darker value to some of these? Again, it's going to be up to you. And getting a chance to play with a little more wet on wet as we deal with opacity. And then one more right over here. So as you layer these, you could plan them ahead. You can visualize how some of these layers will allow you to play with the shapes. And then plan to do 2 or 3 where you build up just a little bit more opacity. That might have gone a little bit too heavy, too quick. You want to develop them just a little bit nice and slow. I'm going to add one more right here just to even it out. A tiny one. And because it's tinier, you may go a little more opaque. It would be okay. That's the general idea. So, seeing how far I can go, I'm going to add a little bit of water to these. Let the pigment be pushed a little bit. Just love that technique. Kind of water over the wet on wet. It does give you usually a nice surprise. Kind of unpredictable sometimes. So making sure this is still dry, I want to play a little bit with some of the shapes of the green that I'm going to play with underneath. The idea would be to make it a little more, I don't want to say abstract, I don't want to say generic, more of a background. Make sure you have the right level of moisture. But if you notice, I'm using a different green here. This is a bit of an earth tone, so it does feel a little warmer. It's a little yellower, but it's in the neutral. So it's actually browner than yellower, if that makes any sense. So in terms of color theory, we're not going towards the yellow. We're actually going towards the middle, towards the brown. Adding a little more saturation. The other thing would be making sure you are using the right brushes. Brushes that are comfortable, so you can grab edges and then maybe work a little bit looser from that edge, just like I did here. Bring in a little bit of water, do a little bit of lifting. But the main thing is make sure you're working at the right time in terms of moisture. You don't want these colors to really just bleed into each other. So that little bit of strategy, that little bit of patience. And we're obviously thinking about the overall look. So I'm just going to flip it around and add a little bit of gravity to this. So we get these edges. Add a little more saturation. And it's not fully random, but definitely a little looser. Much looser than our other sample. A little more shape. And I do like the way this technique is coming along. Softening some of these edges and just letting it become a background, not necessarily specific in terms of detail. I don't feel like I want too much of it, but just kind of being there. Now, not losing total control. You want some of it, so that's why I go back, lift, and in some cases, add a little more consistency to the paint. By consistency, I mean opacity, value. So you have shifts of light, dark within the same color. So let's say one should be come in handy right in here. Nice and loose. And let's do one last one right over here. A little bit darker from the get-go. And go with wet on wet. Once again, getting a few nice shapes to your brush stroke. And not overworked. A little more simplicity goes a long way. Simplicity of expression. So I do like that already. And with watercolor, they always look better when they're fully dry. So they will look incredible tomorrow. But I can already see that that's going to work really nice. Move it aside one more time. Come back to our first and the pencil. So now this feels like it's lacking. But again, you can always add a second, just a little extra. Cannot leave it just like that. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to add a little more water. Just a little bit of lighter background here. Also a little bit looser. Well, I was trying to show you the two samples. One more structured and shaped. But we just need a little bit, just a little bit of color. Back in here, maybe in here. And let's add a little bit of shape to it. Definitely a lot lighter. So what I wanted to do here was finish up what I will plan to do in the middle. Well, that's ultra light there. So lots of way to play with this. Main things to keep in mind: your lines, your shape, your color, your value, contrast, and are they working? Not just about technique, how they all bring all of those fundamentals together. So that could build into something a little later. What I do want to show you here is this. I'm going to go to a smaller brush. We definitely need a smaller brush. This is the number 1. And I'm going to go with a little bit of dark pigment here. So Payne's Gray or an ivory black. A really dark green. How would we darken the green? I could use the same Perlin green and Canyon red to create a neutralized dark color. But I'm just using ivory black here. And again, wet on dry, I'm going to fill in a little bit of this space. So this is a little more linear work. If you like the wet on wet, there's techniques to create this so it doesn't feel like a coloring book. So you would strategize and patiently come up with the steps to have that the way you want it. So I'm going wet on dry. And I'm carefully looking at how it's coming together in and around. How these lines, because of their size, they're small, sharp, and dark, they're going to command a lot of attention. So I don't want to overdo it. So keep them nice, patient. And here we go. Within the edges, your nicest golden yellow. I have a new gamboge. But I also have a gold ink from Winsor & Newton. So this would be another option. If you wanted to go a little bit mixed media, you use inks. This one's gold. And it gives that really beautiful 3D touch. So I'll do the other one with the ink. This one, I want to let it dry fully. And we're going to add that yellow. Nice warm yellow. Don't want it to bleed. Couple of variations to the color. I could go in with just a touch of orange in it. And if you wanted to add one final touch to these, although it shows with a little bit of pencil line, you could extend some of these lines. So I'm using alizarin crimson for some of these veins. Now, if you do every single one, you may find yourself with something that is just a little bit overworked. Well, it's very... This is a matter of taste, honestly. My warning is, it looks nice, but it could easily be overdone. So I'm keeping it a little bit lighter. And there we have it. Just add a little more right here. Now the other option with this one would be ink lines. So using ink pen, like a micron or a permanent ink pen, have your drawing, then watercolor it, or watercolor it, then add ink lines. It actually has that beautiful look to it. Definitely more illustration feel comes to it. Here in this area, I am going to darken the same perlin green, and I mixed just a touch of the cadmium red into it. So notice how we have this beautiful, I need a little bit of this darker, just to add a little bit of space. And I'm entering that realm where I could begin to overwork. So you have to be careful. And make those decisions wisely. Only one way to know if it's going to work, and that is by testing it. I think that will work. Let's add one more right here. And just a beautiful way to play with what is a simple shape in most cases. And it could be simpler. I may have shown you just what could be a little more complex. There's definitely ways to simplify this even more. There we have it. Just waiting for this to fully dry. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same. So I'm loving this background. So that's the difference between this one and this one. I have to bring this. I feel I have to bring this area here a little more loose like this. And I will get there. I started doing it here at the top where if we add a little bit of water, it will have that same effect. Just creating that bit of simple background. Making that white blend in. It's a key factor of knowing how to use your composition, your space in the composition. That's a little bit better already. So here we are. I always recommend looseness as your best friend. Looseness in the mind, not looseness in the hand. Both one follows the other, but looseness in the mind is generally a good place to be. How do you get there? Confidence from practice. So here again, I'm mixing the same perlin green with cadmium red. Adding a little more perlin green instead of the black. And I'm going to add it. Let's go ahead and do wet on wet this time. So I'm going to preserve the middle here. But some of these areas, I want it wet on wet. So adding a little bit of water and bringing that pigment in. So what I want to do is create a little bit of that space in the middle with the dark. And for this one, I do want to use the gold. Just a touch of the gold ink. Now, if you're really interested, there's lots of gold inks that you can use for so many projects. And it also lasts you forever. There we have it. So this needs to dry just a little more. I also feel I want to revisit this and have a nice frame. It could be the key. So I'm just going to lift just a little bit. There we go. And one recommendation is don't use your fancy best brushes when you work with inks. Use ink specific brushes. I usually go with cheaper ones that you can wash right away and still have that. Play it safe, because they could ruin. Excuse me. Very nice. Now, one way to actually enhance this gold ink would be over a dark background. So actually not preserving the white, but coming in with... Show you a little bit of a close-up there, what that looks like. The lighting, actually, it sparkles, but that beautiful gold. So I could have had a little bit of that dark play in between. And I'll let that ink dry, come back in. When using inks, you want to wash and dry that brush right away. And don't leave your ink open for too long either. And there we have it. Two versions, the idea was a little more gestural, and one which is a little more traditional. I just realized I should have done one portrait, one landscape, play with a little bit of the composition. But as you can see, using the reference just as inspiration, beginning to take it in your own way, beginning to strategize the layers, and the way you draw, or draw with color, or with medium, pencil, ink, or just with the brush. The way you can strategize and create all these beautiful, simple forms, and realize how easy and how far they can go. as they come together. Hope you guys enjoyed it.